Security deposits are now legally recognized under the laws of Uganda. A landlord cannot enter the tenant's premises unless they have given the tenant 24-hour notice that has to be written. Then rent in Uganda is going to be paid. If the Landlord and Tenant Bill is passed into law, it will have to be paid in shillings. And then also last but not least is a landlord cannot increase the tenant's rent fee in more or less 12 months. And then lastly is that the landlord has to give notice to the tenant before they can evict them from their property. Let's talk about this and more in regards to the Landlord and Tenant Bill in Uganda. So in case you missed the conversation, the Parliament of the Republic of Uganda recently passed the Landlord and Tenant Bill. And in this video, we're going to talk about everything that you need to know about said bill that is relevant. If you stick around and finish this video in the end, there's also a provision where I will give you a link to download what a tenancy agreement looks like, or the template of a tenancy agreement. So please stick around to this video until the end so that you can be able to get that tenancy agreement. Without further ado, let's proceed with the video. If you're seeing my face for the first time, hello, my name is Nagaib Jawan, and this is the Asking About the Law channel, where we have fair and honest conversations on the nexus of law, technology, trade, tech, finance in Uganda. We release new videos every Sunday, so please subscribe so that you do not miss out on those notifications. The Landlord and Tenant Bill requires that there has to be a tenancy agreement signed between the landlord and the tenant. Now, major takeaways is it provides grounds for how this tenancy agreement should be signed, when it should be signed, and by who. For instance, it requires that the landlord needs to get a form of identification from the tenant. If it's a legal entity like a company, then the company needs to produce its certificate of incorporation in order to be eligible to sign the tenancy agreement. If it's an individual, you need to produce some form of identification. It could be a passport, driving permit, national ID, or if you're a student ID will suffice. Now, other major takeaways you need to know about the tenancy agreement is it can be verbal, oral, or it could be partially verbal, partially oral. But I think the most interesting thing is that the law recognizes that the tenancy agreement can also be attained through biomessage. Now, biomessage could be an SMS, a WhatsApp, an email. That will still suffice. And there's still another major takeaway that you need to know about. If your rent is 500,000 shillings and above, the requirement is that you need to first sign a tenancy agreement. And then when you sign a tenancy agreement, you're entitled to a copy. The landlord is entitled to a copy for transparency and accuracy of bookkeeping. So in regards to maintaining that the premises or the property is kept in good condition, the Landlord and Tenant Bill requires that the landlord maintain the premises in good estate. However, if the property is damaged and it's a result of the tenant, let's say their negligence results into the damage of their property, then it's the duty is now on the tenant to make sure that they carry out the necessary repairs in order to maintain the property in good state. Rent shall be paid on the date and in a manner in which the tenant and the landlord agree on how rent should be paid. However, it proceeds to state that rent will be paid in Ugandan shillings. Therefore, if you're paying rent in dollars, this clause particularly protects you. Then it also proceeds to state that if there is a mutual agreement between the landlord and the tenant on how rent should be paid, then that will suffice. So in regards to instances where a landlord asks for rent in advance, for instance, if you pay rent for 1 month and they ask for 3 months in advance, that's something that the bill factors in and allows the landlord to do this. Again, like I said, if your rent is 1 month, then they're allowed to ask for 3 months. The bill proceeds to address instances of increase of rent, and it provides that a landlord cannot increase rent more than 10% annual of the rent charges. So it also proceeds to provide for a situation where the parliament through the minister's office can intervene and regulate the percentages at which landlords can increase rent. Then it proceeds to state that landlord cannot increase rent without giving you a 90-day notice. So they ought to give you 90 days notice before they can increase your rent. If you're in a fixed tenancy situation, then the landlord cannot increase the landlord cannot increase the rent until your tenancy expires, or unless if you specifically accepted in the clause, there's probably they will sneak a clause into the tenancy agreement where they say that they can increase the rent randomly. Then that's when that's when they can enforce an increased rent. And then lastly, landlord cannot increase rent in a space more than one. Landlord cannot increase rent more than once in a space of 12 months. Any increment in rent that is outside the provisions that are listed in this specific bill is considered as invalid and therefore can be challenged in a court of law. If the rent is increased and you as a tenant do not object or try to challenge it, or you proceed and act in a manner that, accepts the rent, then the law looks at your actions as hereby agreeing to the new increment. It also proceeds to state that if the tenant and the landlord do not come to an agreement in regards to the tenancy, to the rent increment, then the new rate of rent will be recognized as the acceptable rate standards. I'm not sure how many of us are going to appreciate this, but please just share with me your opinions in the comments. I'm really curious to see where you are. So the bill proceeds to give comments in regards to when a tenant fails to make and pay rent. So the bill provides that in the event that the tenant fails to pay rent, then the landlord has the right to petition the courts of law to intervene and help him or they get their rent. So if the matter or the rent at the core of this issue is less than 10 million shillings, then the requirement is that the matter should be filed before the Small Claims Procedure Court. A major takeaway to this effect is that prior, as of recent, I think I did a video about this, as of recent, now in Small Claims Procedure Court, you need to have legal representation. You can no longer go to Small Procedure Court before, because Small Procedure Court before you need not have a lawyer with you, but now as per a recent judgment, you need to have a lawyer represent you in Small Procedure Court. Of security deposit, first of all, it recognizes security deposit, which is separate now from what it defines as rent in advance, and it allows the landlord to charge security deposit. So in regards to security deposits, the law has this to say about this. Your landlord cannot ask you for a security deposit which is more than your monthly rent, and it proceeds to state that where 1 month occupancy of the premises to which the agreement relates to, or 1/12 of the rent of 1 year's occupancy of the premises to which the agreement relates to, whichever is lesser. So I think, and it still does not help. Anyway, tell me in the comments what you think, if you think this is still a reasonable gauge of what can amount to security deposit. So the bill proceeds to address matters or grounds that can amount to termination of the tenancy agreement. 1, you fleeing the properties without the consent or knowledge of the landlord is not legal grounds for being defined as termination of tenancy. However, it provides for termination by tenancy agreement, termination by vacating premises with the consent of the landlord, and then 3 is termination by a specific event. For instance, if you say that on this date I will leave your property, that is still grounds validly looked at as termination. And then most importantly is termination after notice. Now for this, you need to know that it is a requirement both on the landlord and the tenant to give each other notice before they can terminate the tenancy agreement. So if you are staying on the premises using a weekly tenancy agreement, then you need to give 7-day notice. If you were using a monthly tenancy, then you need to give 30-day notice. And then if you are using a yearly tenancy, then you need to give a notice of at least 60 days prior to you terminating the contract. So that conversation we've had above prior was in regards to residential tenancies. Now for business tenancies, the situation is very different, and the bill requires that in respect of business premises, the tenancy notice shall be given at least less than 12 months, more than 6 months. The bill also looks at something where a tenant just abandons the premises and disappears, which is tenancy by abandonment. And it provides that, if you just leave the premises and you don't communicate when you have vacated the premises, it will be looked at as termination by abandonment. So in the event that one of the parties does not feel comfortable with how the tenancy has been terminated, it could be either the landlord or the tenant. They both can appeal before a court of law, and the court of law will address the matter. In the event that the landlord has given you proper notice on when you should evacuate the premises, and you as a tenant do not abide by this notice, hence you do not evict yourself from the property, then the landlord can file a matter before the courts of Uganda, which will intervene to have you evicted from the property. So this is a very interesting one. The law also addresses and considers things in regards to unlawful eviction of the tenant from the property. And it provides that a landlord shall not evict the tenant except as legally provided for in the Landlord and Tenant Bill. In the event that the landlord evicts the tenant from the premises and they have not done that as provided for in the bill, and the courts of law find them guilty for violating the tenant's right, they will be, on conviction, they will be liable to a fine equivalent to 3 months rent payable, or imprisonment. The imprisonment will be 1 year or both. So you could face 1 year in jail and then also pay the fine. And then also they proceed to state that you will also face more penalties, which include you'll have to compensate the tenant for any damages arising out of the unlawful eviction. Interesting. Bill proceeds to provide grounds where the landlord can enter into the tenant's premises, and it requires one, the landlord has to give tenant written notice of 24 hours informing them that they will enter their premises, and they can only enter their premises if they are inspecting, for instance, the repairs that we talked about earlier on that are being done on the property. So if the landlord enter the premises without authorization as provided for in the law, and the courts of law convict them indeed of this matter, then they will be fined for violating the tenant's rights. And then the bill also proceeds to state that the landlord may, at reasonable times of the day, after giving the 24-hour notice to the tenant, they can enter the premises of the tenant for purposes of inspecting the condition of the property. Just curious. How does this, tell me in the comments, how do you feel about this specific provision? I find it very interesting. That I'm just curious. Please tell me in the comments what you think. If you have made it this far into this video, thank you very much. And as promised, if you check in the description box of this video, there is a link to where you can download a template of a tenancy agreement. I hope this helps, and I hope that you find this regulation helpful. Who knows? Anyway, if you have any more questions and inquiries along this matter, landlord and tenants, please leave them in the comment section of this video. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up and share it with a friend who may benefit from this information. I remain yours truly, Nagarib Joanne, and this is the Ask Me About the Law channel, where we have free and honest conversations on the nexus of law, technology, trade, tech, finance in Uganda. There are new videos every week, so subscribe so that you do not miss out on those updates. Until next week's video, we are going to talk about all things registration. We're going to talk about all things registration of community-based organizations, NGOs, and things along those lines.